Let's continue with the Apple Dev tutorial about SwiftUI. In this new chapter, we're going to talk about passing data with bindings. So in the previous tutorial, as we were mentioning, use bindings to share the data between the edit view and the individual UI controls within the view. Now in these tutorials, you will build the editing functions Scrum Tinker using bindings to share the state between different screens in the app. So that's one of the most crucial aspects about SwiftUI, and it's super easy to get started and build, like mock-up UIs and do very fancy things with a declarative UI. It's super easy to work in that way, and obviously things need to get a little trickier when you start talking about data and passing data around and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of important to get a good understanding of this part of the tutorial. So I'm very curious to know how Apple is showing and how Apple is teaching the best practice on that, on passing data around. I think it's crucial, so let's pay attention to this chapter. Pass the edit view a binding to a Scrum data. So as we can see here, the binding, it's a bidirectional, basically communication channel between two screens. Let's see what they say. So you can mutate data passed in detail view. You'll update the edit view to work with a binding to a daily Scrum data value, modify the data view to provide the binding when it is initializing the edit view. You will also add code to update the Scrum data view when the user, okay, cool. So we need to start by going into edit view. Yeah, so instead of owning their own data, they get passed a new source of truth. So as we can see right now, the edit view, it's basically owning its own data with this local state and even creating it every time. But now we're going to be passing a binding, which means the source of truth it's not longer in that view, it's outside. So let's go into edit view and just change the state property to a binding. So that's the first thing we need to do. And we immediately see an error because you cannot initialize a binding. But let's see how they say that. So because the Scrum data is now passed in during installations, you need to remove the private attribute of daily Scrum data. Okay, so we remove the private from here and we stop passing it in. So we can get it from the outside. And in theory, nothing else changes because what we're getting here through a state, it's kind of like you're getting a binding to a state. So if you already have a binding, it's like you're getting a binding into a binding already. So all of this code should still work perfectly fine. Updating the Scrum data creates a compile error because edit view now requires a binding. You will see similar errors through the tutorial as you update other views. Makes sense? Pass a constant binding to the edit view initializer in the previews. You can use the constant type. What? Type method? Yeah, I guess I often call them static methods or class methods. I guess, yeah, type method is a more generic way of saying the same. To create a binding to a hard-coded immutable value. Constant bindings are useful in previews or when prototyping your app. Cool. So if we scroll here, we say we're passing a constant binding. Let's go here, and if we tell Xcode to use a fixit, we can get the constant as a type method here, and then we have this daily Scrum basically mock data, so we can pick the first of them and get the data out. So it's gonna create a constant binding. So this makes everything compile. This kind of makes it work, not exactly, but as before. Now, when you go in the detail view, let's go detail view, there you go. Here we need to fill this, but before that, we need to create the local state. So as you can see, we have pushed kind of the local state that was on the edit view up into the hierarchy where it belongs, on the detail view. That's where it should be, and that's where we are putting it. So this is the same line that we have before, and now it just lives here. We can just pass the data, so the empty initializer creates an instance with default values for properties. Now you will update these values to match the selected Scrum when the user taps the edit button. Set data to Scrum data in edits button action closure. So when you are editing here, now we say the data, which was just like a default one, like it's like you can consider it like actually kind of nil because it's just a default one that we created on the fly. It doesn't have any meaning on the app itself. But instead of just using nil, I guess they prefer to use a real one to avoid having to deal with nil types. But once you click edit, we assign a real one into it. So we're getting the data from the Scrum that we are editing, basically. and we assign it into that local state, which is gonna become now the state that we are modifying. And now we pass it here basically. So we need to pass the data as a binding. So we don't pass data directly because that will be like kind of like a copy, an immutable copy of that data. But instead we pass a binding, which is going to create basically bidirectional connection between this detail view and the edit view we're creating. Next, add code to update the Scrum when the user taps done. So now when the edit view, when it says that we are done, we update the local Scrum. So remember, we have the Scrum that we are displaying here. We basically need to go here and on done, we say Scrum. What is it calling? Update from data. But for this, we will need to make something mutable, basically, correct? Yeah, code display is a compile error because Scrum is a constant. So as we can see here, it's a constant. Makes sense. Now we need to convert the Scrum constant to a variable, which they're doing here. Using binding ensures the detail view re-renders when Scrum is modified. Why I'm pausing here? Because they just pull out that kind of without much explanation. So it's that, I mean, it's totally true. But if you say, okay, let's put this as a variable, okay, but now we want it to be basically so that this view re-renders automatically when this changes. And for that, we are seeing everywhere that we're using state. But here they tell us directly to use binding. And makes sense because state basically lets you have a property that re-renders the view, but that property is local. And instead, the Scrum from previous tutorials, we know that it's injected from the outside. So if you combine both of those requirements, you basically need to use a binding. I just kind of hoped that they explained this. Requires a little bit more explanation. And then pass a constant binding to details view initializer in the previews. Yeah, the same thing that we did before. Data screen now passes the change to data view, but before you can view those changes in the app, you will need to finish passing bindings through the rest of the hierarchy. Aren't they gonna tell me about this update method? So I'm assuming it's one of these cases again where the information is in the project files. I don't like the fact that you're making a tutorial, like you're making an application following a tutorial, and every chapter, like they want you to just drop everything to the floor and pick their own things. I don't like that at all. So yeah, so this is just an update method where you get the new data and you update each piece of your local data with it. But yeah, again, I don't know. I don't like it. It's probably one of the worst things about this tutorial, in my opinion. But yeah, and I'm not gonna say anything more about that, but I find it kind of confusing for people that you always assume that things are, I don't know, maybe that's how tutorials are, but I don't know, I find it super confusing. So pass the detail view binding to Scrum. Scrum views should reflect the changes users make on the edit screen. To accomplish this, you need to pass a binding down the view hierarchy, correct? You will start by changing the Scrum's property from a constant to a binding. Then you will add a function that creates bindings to individual items in the Scrum's array and pass those bindings to detail view. So we have done right now, it's, I don't know if I have it here. Yeah. So what we have done right now, it's on this view, which is the detail view, when you click edit, now we have these two views communicated. So the detail with the edit. So in theory, this, once we recompile and we run, these two things are connected. Now, the missing step is to pass a binding to this Scrum inside this array, inside this screen, to this one. So instead of just passing a copy of it, pass a binding. So when you change the title and stuff like that, when you go back, it's all updated here. Okay, so we're basically doing everything again through the entire chain on the navigation stack. So let's start by converting the Scrums to a constant, the Scrums constant to a binding. So this is now in the Scrums view. The Scrums view, we make this binding to an array of daily Scrums. Cool. And the next thing is, again, we use a constant. We were passing constant data before, so it's super easy now to just make a binding to the constant data. So not much changes there. And now, what do we have here? So here is like a tricky thing, which I'm surprised. Like, it's super interesting they explain this. Okay, so let's see. Because the for each view passes a scrum into its closure, but detail view initializer expects a binding to a scrum. So you need to add a utility method to retrieve a binding from individual scrum. So you have a binding to an array, and now you need to get a binding to a specific item in that array. This works out of the box, for example, on the composable architecture. So it's kind of weird that they make you build this. That's so weird the way they do it. Because pay close attention to this. This method expects a scrum. So when you're passing a scrum here, you are literally passing a copy of that value. But if you think about it, you want to create a binding, which it means that you need to somehow mutate that value, and not only that value, but that value inside the original array, which you don't have access from here. So what they do, they pick this copy of the value, and they go into the array and they look for the index. And I guess now we're gonna use the index to create the proper binding and like go through the array's index and mutate it like that, which is convoluted because value types and arrays are value types and all that stuff in Swift. So it's kind of convoluted because of that. But I find it interesting that they do this shenanigans here because, of course, you don't have the index already because you're using a for each with a scrum. If you change the for each to use indices, for example, you could get the index directly. And then, yes, you kind of complicate a little bit more here. But now, like since Swift 5.3, where you have kind of like you can just put local variables and like everything works out of the box. I don't know what I will pick, to be honest, but it's an interesting thing to take into account. Anyway, let's see how we complete this. So now complete the method by returning a binding to the scrum. The $sign prefix accesses the projected value of the wrapped property. The projected value of the scrum's binding is another binding. Yeah, that's super cool. So it's not much code at the end. You need to do this everywhere. You need, like, every time you need to do something like this. Every time you need a binding into an array, you kind of need to do something like this, unless you use the index here, stuff like that. That's why I don't know. Maybe it would have been better to use the index here. But anyway, this is super powerful. It's kind of using Swift, like many of the features from Swift, like key path, dynamic member lookup. When you combine these two things, you can have you can traverse hierarchies dynamically, but with static checks, which is super powerful. And that's basically what they do here. Like you can pass the index to get the object at that specific value. Just dynamically, that's going to be creating for you a new binding, which is kind of super powerful and easy to just say, oh yeah, it's super easy. Like you do this line here, not much complexity, but these things, like as they always say in point 3, this line packs a punch. There is a lot of complexity down in like just hidden here, and it's super cool that you can just do this and everything works. And as are gonna see now, makes everything super nice. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And now of course we need to use it to put a binding for this scrum. So at the end of the day, I don't know, I like it. It's not that bad. It's just that maybe this somehow, I don't know, maybe it should be kind of like encapsulated better. Now we can pass the list view a binding. So Scrum Dinker app defines the entry point and the structure of your app. In this section, you will create a source of truth for your app's data by adding a state property to the Scrum Dinker's app. Then you will pass a binding to that data down the hierarchy. So again, we're repeating the same kind of transition we started here. So we started linking the detail into the edit. That's done. Now we linked this list of daily scrums into the detail of a specific daily scrum. So we did all this link with bindings. And now what we are doing, we're gonna pull out the data, the source of data from the Scrum views itself, and we're gonna pull it up a notch. So we're going into the Scrum Dinker app. Now what we are gonna do, and it doesn't compile, so we're gonna make a binding. Well, yes, it's a state, it's not a binding because we're the source of the data. This is the source of truth, so a binding will be if somebody else injected, but we're at the root level, we're on the app, so there is nobody else to pass it in. So it's a state, correct. So now in theory, we can run. Let's build, yeah, it builds and it runs. And let's see what they say. So run and edit the Scrum. After you tap the done button, the detail and the list views should display the method experiment. Open the Scrum view in a live preview mode and try editing a Scrum. Why are your changes discarded when you tap done? Okay, let's go step by step. So we have design. Let's edit design, for example. So let's click edit. Let's change the color, make it red. Design. Let's say, let's put, because there is always a lot of people. Scrums are super slow, let's say 20 minutes, and let's add somebody else, David. We click done, and now this has immediately changed it, 20 minutes, red, and David is here. And if we go back, now it's red, says development, says 5, 20 minutes. Pretty cool, right? So that's what we have accomplished just by changing the constants on our data we inject from the outside. We change that to bindings, and bindings, it's what creates this bidirectional relationship, which allows us to, like, imagine from here, from the source of the app, we have drilled down into a list, the detail, and an extra screen, and you change something here, click done, and it's immediately updated here and here. That's the power of SwiftUI and bindings and the data flows that we are using here. It's super cool, and bindings adds a little bit of complexity in terms of realizing where data changes and stuff like that, but that's a discussion for another day. So let's do this experiment. The Scrum view, live preview. Okay, so let's go to the Scrum view. So we have a live preview here. I guess we need to run the live preview. And if we click here and we edit, we click done, and it doesn't change. Why is that? I mean, of course, it doesn't change because you are creating a binding with the data, but you're creating it constant. So it doesn't matter what you do. There is basically a binding. If you look at the definition of a binding, I don't know if it's going to be explained in the tutorial, but I'm explaining you this because I think it's interesting to see how it works. I thought they were going to explain this when we were going to create to access the index, but they already gave us that done on the framework, so that's not the case. So what is a binding? A binding is an object that you create, and it has, when you create it, you pass it two closures. One to get the value, and another to set the value. So it's like a property, but you are kind of wrapping the property in an object and passing it around. That's conceptually what a binding is. So why is it not changing when we are here on this experiment? Because it's a constant. So a constant binding, it's given us by the framework, but what a constant binding is it just has a get property. So it just implements this side of it. It doesn't implement this one. Maybe the definition says it. So create a binding to a value that cannot change. So internally, you can, of course, we don't have the source code, but you can see obviously how it's done, where the get, it's giving the value that you pass it, but the set, it's never mutating anything. So that's why nothing happens when you are using a preview. So in this tutorial, you use add state to create the source of truth for a value type, and you use binding to share the right access to a state with other items. The next chapter, you will learn about some additional property wrappers that allow you to work with reference type data. True, because for now, all of this, it's basically value types. So if we go at the app, so we go at the root of everything, we have here. So it's a state. This is basically what holds all the data in our application. And we can see that it's just a struct. It's value types. And what we're doing is we're mutating value types thanks to the binding and thanks to some stuff that SwiftUI does, but these are value types. If you wanted to do similar things with reference types, you need another set of tools. So before finishing this episode, let's check out our understanding. Which code snippet displays login message view in the preview canvas? So we have the login message view. binding for a name, welcome back. Which code snippet displays login message view in the preview canvas? You're making the previous provider. I mean, isn't it this one? What it's weird. It's a binding, so you need to provide from the outside, so it's not this one. So I guess it's this one. This one, it's not working because the preview provider, it has like this previous method, it's a static method. And this variable is not a static variable. So you cannot do this. So it has to be this one. Correct. Which code snippet lets child view modify the message that appears in parent view? So the parent view has the state with a message, and we pass a child view, we pass it a binding to the message. This looks all right for now. This is a bar, but it's not a state, so it's not going to update anything, and we're not passing it as a binding either, so nope. And this is a state, so it's going to refresh the screen, but you're not passing it as a binding, so it's not going to feed back the changes. So it's the first one. Correct. And the last question, what is the type of book identifier? So identifier is an integer in the book struct. We have a book, which is a state, and where if we do book identifier, it's basically when you're using the $, you're getting a binding. You're getting a binding to the book, and then you're accessing it, the identifier, through the binding. So you're getting a binding to an int, which is the type of the identifier. You're not getting a state, no, you're getting a binding. Even if this is a state, what you get is always a binding. Correct. And that's it for this part of the tutorial. So thank you for watching, and let's go to the next one.